There was a question, I think, a while back that somebody asked about was Plato an altruist, and how do we relate? Is altruism a modern concept? Was it invented by Christianity? Does it have older roots as an ideology? And are some of those roots, do they go back to Plato?
Um, if by altruism's a little ambiguous, it can mean a few things. So if we mean by altruism the idea that other people are what we should be living for, we should be living for others. That's how Comte put it. Um, and then that's a modern idea. You get Comte putting it in that way in the 19th century. You have, if you're going to have an earlier analog to that, it's maybe there are some things in Stoicism, but I would say especially Jesus, this idea that you're what you do to the least of my brothers is what you do unto me, and this orientation towards other people, and particularly I think this is a kind of very central to Christianity, to the least well-off other people, to the poor, etc., to the downtrodden, to the meek, etc. That is a particularly Christian thing. That is the orientation not just to other people, but to the people that you might look down on. Um, but in Christianity, of course, it's not because you're actually going to be able to help those people. Jesus didn't think you could accomplish much of anything, right? It's to show your devotion to God and to emulate God in not caring for yourself and caring about those people. So that I think is a particularly Christian view. And then the modern view that you're serving other people is what I think you get in Comte, and then in a little bit less of a gross form in Mill in utilitarianism and Bentham and other utilitarians. But so if we're talking about the serving other people in particular, then I think it's this modern view, other people in effect taking the place of God as the thing to which you should sacrifice. But if the idea is that morality is about sacrificing and sacrificing yourself to something, and other people just happen to, be the people that this theory puts into that place, um, then the view is, of course, older and much more widespread. And so Kant, for example, Kant with a K, not Comte with a C, Kant is not an altruist in the sense of thinking you should have your life oriented around other people. He doesn't think you should be trying to achieve things for them any more than you should be trying to achieve values for yourself. What you should be doing is trying to live in the way that he thinks is rational, which is by being willing to sacrifice everything to these impersonal duties. And there's a variant of that kind of view in Plato and the Stoics as well, an earlier form of the view that um, Kant is the kind of paradigm of. And it's a variant of, and I think maybe less virulent form of it, because it's not explicitly anti-self in the way that Kant's theory is. So Kant is thinking of anything for you, anything that promotes your happiness, as an object of inclination or desire. He calls it inclination, and he's defining the moral by explicit contrast to that. Whereas all the Greek philosophers, including Plato, or at least all the significant ones, thought that it's best for you yourself to be virtuous. And so in that sense, you can think that they're all egoists or have an egoistic element. Virtue is going to be good for you. It's your own flourishing life, etc. However, there's a sense in which some of the time they're thinking of virtue in a way where the content of it is coming from a prior understanding of what's good for you. And these virtues are either part of that or a means to attain it, or maybe some package deal of those two things. I think that you can find that in Aristotle. You can find that in a way in Epicurus. I think much wrong in both of their views, but some idea of it's intelligible how we're understanding this virtue as your good. And even in some of Plato's writings. But in other places in Plato, and also especially in the Stoics, they're thinking of what's good for you is or is largely about getting virtue. And the content of virtue is not at all derived from a prior understanding of your own good. And sometimes is understood by contrast to the things that people ordinarily regard as good. So much so that we're starting to get a kind of proto version of the self as the opposite of value, which I think is what you get pure in Kant. And there's
Okay,
one
so,
or two places where Plato approaches Kant on that. He says, self-love is where bad actions come from in the laws.
and to what extent is Aristotle a repudiation of that, of the worst of in Plato.
Well, one way you could put it is Aristotle's an embrace of the best in Plato. This
Hmm.
idea that virtue is what's good for you. Virtue is the living up, is valuing your own soul and living up to your reason and so forth, which particularly in the early Socratic dialogues, there's a lot of and has a very egoistic flair to it. Um, and and some in the Republic and elsewhere also. But Aristotle's much more explicit that there isn't any sacrifice ever involved in doing what's best for you. Sorry, in being virtuous, that
Yeah.
virtue is the thing most worth having. Again, Plato, in most moods, will say things like that. But there is this passage where Plato says, or the Athenian stranger, one of the characters in the Laws who's speaking for him, says that we shouldn't be self-lovers. We should be lovers of the good and of reason. And indeed, self-love is where everything bad comes from. And there are a few early passages in Aristotle or pseudo-Aristotle that echo some of those themes. But in his main writing on ethics, the Nicomachean Ethics, he has this really bold passage that even though selfishness, self-love, philautos, love, phil like in philosophy and autos, self, this is a term of opprobrium. People use it as an insult. But and the people that people call selfish are typically bad people. They're thieves and so forth. But the virtuous man is actually more so a lover themselves. He loves himself more than anybody else, and we should be lovers of self in the way he is. And this is a really bold move, reclaiming a term of opprobrium. Um,
Hmm.
and Aristotle doesn't do that kind of thing often, but he does it there with that term. And on a few other points where he's wanting to stress that what's good is good for you, and you're like, there's no conflict between what's right, what's rational, and what's best for you.